Good morning everyone and welcome to the Equal Opportunity Committee's 5th meeting of 2013, and can I also welcome the visitors in the public gallery. Can I ask that everyone sets their mobile phones to either completely off or to flight mode. At the table, along with members and witnesses, are the clerking and research team, official reporters and broadcasting services, and around the room we are supported by the security office. My name is Mary Fee and I'm the committee convener. This morning we have apologies from John Finney, sorry John, yes. My brain is gone, Dennis Robertson, and we are joined by James Dornan. And I'll now ask the committee members and witnesses to introduce themselves.
Marco Biaggi, MSP for Edinburgh Central and Deputy Convener.
Warwick Mahon, MSP for Central Scotland.
John Finney, MSP Highlands and Islands.
James Dornan, MSP for Glasgow Cathcart.
John Mason, MSP for Glasgow Shedleston.
I'm Gordon Patterson, I'm the team leader in the Private Housing Services team within Scottish Government.
Margaret Burgess, Minister for Housing and Welfare.
Leslie Irving from the Equality Unit.
Thank you for that. Agenda item 1 today is a decision on taking business in private. The committee is asked to agree whether it would like to consider its approach to its Women in Work inquiry in private at future meetings. Do we have agreement on that? That's now agreed. Thank you. Agenda item 2 is ministerial evidence on where gypsy travellers live. Now, committee members have a number of questions for the witnesses, but before we open up questions, could I ask the Minister to make a few opening remarks?
Okay, thank you, Convener, and I appreciate the opportunity to come along and take part in this inquiry on where gypsy travellers live. It's clear from the evidence that's been presented to the committee over the last few months that there does remain issues with regard to acceptance, provision and leadership to support the gypsy traveller way of life in Scotland. The Scottish Government recognised gypsy travellers as a distinct ethnic group and encourage others to do the same. We also recognise that gypsy traveller communities are among the most disenfranchised and discriminated against in Scotland. Many of the issues arising in local communities can be of a sensitive nature, and with this comes the need to balance the rights of gypsy traveller population to follow their traditional way of life and the right of local communities. The themes of the committee inquiry are wide-ranging and don't fit neatly just into the housing and welfare portfolio. In recognition that this inquiry has covered a range of accommodation issues from identification of need, site provision, quality and management, I'm supported this morning by officials from Housing and from Equalities Division. However, across all the findings of this inquiry, the Scottish Government wishes to work collaboratively with the committee to consider the issues raised and a way forward to better address them.
Thank you for that, Minister. Committee have a number of questions. The first question that we have is around housing standards and sites, and I'm going to bring in John Finney and then Marco Biaggi. John.
Thank you, Convener. Minister. Thank you for these encouraging opening remarks. Minister, I wrote you in a constituency capacity some months ago about the housing quality standards, and I got a reply confirming that the amenity blocks are not covered by the housing quality standard that's applied. I just wonder if there's an opportunity to consider such an approach with regard to the amenity blocks. And another issue that we hear, there's the general fabric of some of the sites, so hard standing for the trailers, for instance.
Certainly, it's something we're willing to look at. I don't know if it's something we can take into the quality standards, but certainly I'll feed that back. But it certainly is a concern to me in reading the reports of the condition of some of the sites, and that's certainly something we'd be wanting to take forward when you issue your final report on this.
And would there be an opportunity at that point to look at the range of facilities that are there? Some of them there's a dearth of children's play areas. We saw a well-appointed child's play area at the Clinterty site, but effectively on grass, no boundary around it, on a bank beside rocks. So is that something that could be picked up on too, the general fabric and amenities?
I think we'd be looking overall at the sites, what sites are there, what provision is on each site, and looking at that, looking at what's good, what is not so good, and taking it forward on that basis.
Thank you, Minister. Moving on a bit from that, then, is there an opportunity perhaps then to have that travellers' sites to be considered as part of the national planning process and guidance issued in respect of that as well?
I think there currently is guidance in the national planning process. Perhaps Gordon,
There is,
you want
yeah,
to come in on that?
Within
There is
the
guidance.
within national planning policy, there is a requirement for local authorities to provide or to consider the needs of gypsy travellers in the provision of sites. Now, I respect from what's been heard at the committee, there's concern over the allocation of sites across local authorities and due consideration given to it, and perhaps the strength that's there in the planning guidance at the moment. The guidance is up for review and consultation on that is going to be opened in the spring. That's both on national planning policy guidance and on the national planning framework. So there'll be an opportunity there to build in the recommendations from this committee and to think about them alongside what the planning guidance actually says.
Well, that's very welcome, and I think we need to look forward rather than look back. But has there been any assessment of the effectiveness of that? Because I've repeatedly found myself saying here there are a number of local authorities who are providing facilities. These facilities are the subject of criticism. There's a great number of other local authorities who are keeping their head down and doing nothing. So, I mean, I appreciate it's a complicated area, and some of my colleagues will speak about the numbers count and how that would impact in any assessment of need. But has there been any assessment of the effectiveness of that in the existing guidance then?
In terms of there's perhaps two parts to this. There's the national planning guidance and in relation to what appears in local development plans that local authorities are providing. And that's where the sites, the identification of sites within local authority areas. Now that was introduced in 2009 at the point where local authorities are developing the local development plans. We engage with the local authority at that point and have a dialogue in relation to how the needs of gypsy travellers are being considered. There hasn't been an assessment of that as such. It's not the role of the Scottish Government to assess the plans themselves, nor to have a kind of statutory monitoring role in it. But we do pick it up in terms of the ongoing engagement that we have with local authorities, both on the planning side and on the housing need demand assessment and local housing strategy side as well. As you're probably aware, the local authorities have a statutory duty to provide prepare a local housing strategy, and that's supported by housing need demand assessment evidence. At the moment we're in the process of reviewing the local housing strategies that are being developed. That's a peer review process of which the Scottish Government works with peer local authorities. So through that, we're confident that there is an open dialogue there with all local authorities around Scotland in terms of the level to which gypsy traveller issues are considered alongside the needs of other population groups. The ongoing monitoring of that is through dialogue between officials and local government officials.
You used the term, if I may, Convener, thanks. You used the term evidence there, Mr. Patterson, and evidence we would see the delivery of the strategy on the ground. Now, my colleague Alec Johnson isn't here, and I'm sure had he been here, he would have asked about the North East, where there's considerable effort gone with a number of bodies, as you're aware, to try and identify a site there. Now, that's particularly important for a number of reasons. The limitations of the existing provision, plus the traditional travelling patterns which see people come from far afield to the North East. What hope can we give Mr Johnson that his constituents are going to see an improvement?
I think in terms of, and it's been highlighted I think throughout the report, that the North East were given money from the Scottish Government specifically to identify new sites, and we are in regular dialogue with them about it. But at the end of the day, it's the local elected representatives in that area that have to, they know the area, they have to choose the sites, and also, in my view, they have to do it in cooperation with the gypsy travellers themselves, because the site has got to meet their requirements as well as the requirements of the local authority. And I think it has been identified throughout that there's not always been in any area in Scotland necessarily that the community support for the gypsy travellers when identifying sites, and that is very often why the planning is not approved. It's not approved by local elected representatives quite often. So I think there's work to be done in terms of what we said at the beginning, about the discrimination against the Gypsy traveller communities. We have to work in that, and I think there has to be dialogue, and I think we have to do it as well through COSLA, because that's where the Scottish Government has their agreement with local authorities, and it's not an agreement of we don't regulate the local authorities, but I do think that we have to go into a real serious dialogue about this with COSLA, with this issue and other issues that have been identified through your inquiry.
Thank you for that, Minister. You use the term discrimination, and it's evident that there is widespread and ongoing discrimination. That's with the processes we've got at the moment. Does that not suggest the need for radical alternative processes, perhaps with a ministerial lead crossing the various portfolios, whether that's housing, planning, health?
I think it's been absolutely identified just how many portfolios this issue crosses. Currently, I think it sits, under equalities with other ministers feeding into it, but it's certainly something, once your report is produced, that we'd certainly be willing to look at, is how we as a government can oversee what's happening in all the portfolios to ensure that the message is getting out there and that any issues identified, which we take very seriously, are actually transferred and we start to see the improvements. Yep.
Siobhan McMahon, a supplementary on that point.
Thank you. We heard in evidence from the AHRC that the Concordat might be a barrier to intervention, and they suggested alternatives. Have you got a view on that, and do you see the Concordat as a barrier to the intervention?
I think if the Concordat with local, with COSLA and the Scottish Government, no, I don't see it being a barrier, but I think it's something that we have to work at with COSLA and with local authorities. Some, as has been identified, there is very good practice out there in some of the Gypsy traveller sites, and there's some very poor practice, and I think it's about collaborative working and taking people with us rather than necessarily legislating, which might not always be the best thing. And I think that was suggested by, I think it was the Grampian Police, who said that, an area in the northeast, the issue there is not necessarily the issue in other parts of Scotland, so it's about addressing it locally. I think anything that is done locally and built up through local stakeholders actually is more sustainable than something that comes from the top down. But we certainly will be raising this with COSLA. It's been identified clearly through your inquiry, and we will be pursuing it.
If it's found to be a barrier, the Concordat, you will look at other ways of getting round and making intervention work for the Gypsy travellers, which isn't happening at the moment.
If it's found to be a barrier and we can't come to an agreement, we'll certainly look at it again. Thank you.
Just before I bring in Marco Biagi, Minister, I wanted to ask you about the local authorities and the guidance that's given to them on provision of sites, because we've heard throughout our evidence session that local authorities are given guidance. They are under no statutory obligation to provide sites. But we have heard from a number of people that have given us evidence that they feel that one of the ways to tackle this problem would be for government to legislate and tell local authorities that it should be an obligation for them to provide sites. And I'd be interested in your view on that. And the other thing that you touched on was the involvement of the travellers in the planning process. And we've heard from a number of travellers throughout our evidence, and on no occasion have travellers been involved in the planning process. And I wonder how you see that being taken forward. How can local authorities, who and on the whole are quite resistant to involving Gypsy travellers in the planning process, how can you ensure that they are involved?
I think there was two questions there. One is, should we legislate to make local authorities provide the sites? I don't see that as resolving it, because at the end of the day, it's still them that have got to determine where that site's going to be and go through their planning process, and we'd be back, I think, to where we are just now. I think it is more about working with COSLA. I think, yes, we would make it very clear that we'd expect all stakeholders to be involved, and the main stakeholder, one of the main stakeholders, is clearly the Gypsy travelling community, and I would certainly expect them to be involved, and we would want to see that in any process that a local authority is taking forward. So I think there's lots of things that are coming up here that we as a government are going to have to take back to COSLA and to local authorities in trying to get this resolved, because it's clearly not working at the moment.
And just finally, before I move on, when government gives guidance, what follow-up do you do to make sure that that guidance is followed? And if it's not followed, what steps do you take?
Guidance is guidance, but we would expect it to be followed to an extent. We had guidance in homelessness, and for a number of years the guidance wasn't followed, and then eventually local authorities all brought up to scratch and were following the guidance. So I think that's patchy, and it's something we maybe should look at. But as the guidance is being reviewed and rewritten or prepared again, I think then that's when we look at what we'd expect, what sort of monitoring we would put in, and what the expectation would be from us, from the local authority. And if it's not been followed, it has to be brought to our attention, and then we can look at it. I don't know if you want to add to that, Gordon.
That's absolutely. I mean, the guidance is just that. It is guidance. But there is an ongoing dialogue, and I think that's quite important to acknowledge that there's an ongoing dialogue between the Scottish Government and local authorities, both at the national level and through the local network of offices that we have with the housing supply. And they work on all housing related needs. What to me seems to be the fundamental points here is ensuring that there's an up-to-date needs analysis that supports what the needs of the Gypsy Traveller community are, alongside the needs of wider community. A detailed site analysis where sites are being identified, ensuring that they're analysed properly to ensure that they meet the requirements of the Gypsy Traveller population that they're specifically aiming to meet, because I think the committee has identified that needs are different around the country and from different groups. It's not a one-size-fits-all in the same way as it isn't for any other population group. And that point about relevant and properly accountable community engagement is important as well. And I think it was picked up earlier on in the inquiry, this idea of legitimate concerns and what's a legitimate concern about a site not being adequate. And I think that's on all sides, be it the local authority, be it other stakeholders, be it the settled community or the Gypsy Traveller community. So I think that a mix of those four areas, in terms of analysis, site needs analysis, site analysis, community engagement, and consideration of legitimate views, is what would give the strength to sites moving forward, and matched with that dialogue that is ongoing at the moment between Scottish Government and local authorities. I would hope that there could be a strength there that could progress sites to be developed without the requirement for the heavy hand of legislation to push that forward.
For that, I've got a supplementary from John Finney, and then I'm going to bring in Marco Biagi.
It's to the Minister, and it's building on the points that Mr Patter's made, and I don't doubt that the vast majority of people are acting in absolute good faith, and don't doubt we've got wonderful policies sitting in filing cabinets across the local authorities and health boards. The difficulty is when you use the word needs, because we've heard repeatedly in evidence that the Gypsy Traveller community, and this flies in the face of the Minister's commendable opening remarks about maintaining the lifestyle. We've been told repeatedly that care and accommodation needs will be met if they take a house. Now that isn't sustaining a lifestyle. That is saying we're disregarding your lifestyle, your traditions, and we'll resolve these issues if you get in a house. What can be done to stop that? Because that's notwithstanding all these very fine policies that are there. We've heard that. And indeed, colleagues will talk about the numbers perhaps later on, and that is, again, the assessment is very complicated because people are unwilling to identify themselves sometimes because of the difficulties they have encountered. So asking someone to abandon their lifestyle in order to access public services seems to me to fly in the face of the commendable aspiration of the Scottish Government to maintain the lifestyle.
We're very clear that we do think the Gypsy Travellers' way of life should be maintained, and I would agree with you that people should not be forced to give up a lifestyle simply to get services. And if, through the inquiry there's strong evidence of that, then it's something we will certainly look at and take very seriously. And when we say that Gypsy Travellers have to be, you know, local authorities should accommodate and have provision for gypsy travellers. We mean very clearly gypsy travellers and their lifestyle and their way of life. And if that's not clear enough, then that's something we will make clear.
Following on from that, I do hear the word dialogue quite a lot, and that's broadly where we've been for the last 10 years and probably more in terms of the relationship between national government and local government. What would you identify as having been the blockage to greater progress in the last 10 years? If you're talking about the solutions now being essentially reviewing what's already being done.
Well, I mean, there have been things done over the last 10 years. There have been, you know, considerable improvements in terms of the Scottish Government provided funding from the housing budget for local authorities to improve their sites, and a number of works have been done in that. That funding is still going to local authorities, but it's going through their general budget now with the ring fencing being done away with. So there have been things done. We had the ministerial involvement in the North East as well, and at the time that was successful, deemed to be good and good practice. There's good practice out there. Perhaps what has not happened is it's not been coordinated perhaps well enough, and that's what we're seeing now, and I think that's what the inquiries of this committee are showing up quite clearly. So it may well be it hadn't been properly and effectively coordinated, and I think we need to do something still about the discrimination and about removing that discrimination element of it, which is in many local authority areas, not just with the community, but in some instances with councillors and community councillors, and in some areas with MPs, and I hope not any MSPs, but certainly, you know, I have seen that frequently.
I would echo that. I've seen some quite shocking comments from, I think it was Renfrewshire in particular, from an MP. But moving on to the area I'd been mainly intending to ask about, one of the suggestions that has been put forward as a way of dealing with both community relations and providing adequate levels of sites is a greater use of transit sites, short stay sites. In particular, the North East study identified a need for potentially dozens in the North East to deal with the issue of unauthorised encampments. There have been a mix of views expressed in this in evidence. I'd be very grateful if you could give the government perspective on whether such short stay sites are a useful tool and something that local authorities should be pursuing.
I mean, I think they are a useful tool, and I think if the gypsy traveller community think they're a useful tool, then that is something we should be looking at. But obviously, short stay sites have the same, they have to have some provision, they have to have provision for X number of caravans, they have to have toilet facilities. So again, we're down to the local authority and the planning and ensuring that they get a site that meets the needs of the travelling community and also the settled community. But I think the reports are going to highlight a number of issues that we're going to have to go cross parties, was mentioned earlier, across portfolios in the government and look at how we can take it forward.
Observed with short stay sites, transit sites, whatever term you want to use, many of the same problems as with permanent sites, that there is often strong opposition from the settled community any time one is proposed. I think anybody who expects 30 transit sites to be approved by the planning process in the North East alone is probably living in dreamland, given how the planning process works. How can we make that work better? Do you think it is simply a case of government providing a challenge to the discriminatory attitudes that are often prevalent, or is there something else that can be done?
I think part of it is providing, trying to deal with the discrimination. I think if that hurdle can be, as it's happened in many other areas where there's a group being discriminated against, once that hurdle has crossed, then I think both councils and settled communities we'll have less fear of what's happening. But I think we have to look at other things as well. We have to talk seriously to the local authorities. And again, I have to keep stressing we have to take this through COSLA because of the Concordat Agreement, but we have to talk seriously about the issues being raised at this committee and about the need for transit sites.
Question.
Okay,
Go
just
ahead.
before you move
It's
off
on
this,
transit sites.
it's to do with transit sites. James Dornan has a supplementary, but just before I bring James Dornan in, can I just ask you, Minister, one of the things that we heard in evidence, excuse me, from gypsy travellers themselves was that a possible solution to the lack of transit sites would be the unblocking of the traditional stopping places. And I wonder what your view on that would be?
I think that's something I'd have to look at because it depends where those traditional blocking places are, depends what state they're in now, what would take to bring them back up to standard to be used again. So on that, what I would say in that is look at that, I'll certainly look at that and come back to the committee on that if necessary. But without knowing, I don't at this stage know where those sites are, which ones have been blocked, what state they're in, how long they've been blocked for. I think we need to look at all that first.
That's very helpful. I mean, one of the things that we did here was some of the traditional stopping places are simply large lay-bys that now have the sign up to say no overnight camping. Not all of them were like that, but that was certainly one example that we were given. So it would certainly be very helpful if you could go away and have a look at that. Mr. Patterson, did you want to come in on that?
I was just thinking in terms of it's been clear on the reasons why these sites were blocked in the first instance, and was it due to quality? Was it due to location against facilities? I'm aware that in Aberdeen certainly they've identified a checklist for which they look at the location of sites and score in relation to access to facilities and services and what have you. And I wonder whether, to what extent the sites that have been blocked because they don't meet that need, they don't provide the necessary suitability, or they're blocked because of health and safety reasons, or they're blocked because of other legitimate reasons. And I think that would have to be taken into consideration when we were looking at any unblocking or reopening of such sites.
Because one of the things we heard as well, that quite often those traditional stopping places were simply used for an overnight stop. That a range of facilities may not be required. And certainly the view of some of the gypsy travellers was it would be quite simple to open them up.
I'm conscious that the dialogue through the committee inquiries has uncovered a number of things in relation to the requirement for permanent sites, requirement for transit sites, short stay sites, and it's a mix of all these. It's not just one solution. It's the mix in the right area. Alongside that, I wonder if there's a requirement to look wider than a simple solution of just providing sites with fixed facilities on them, and perhaps that point plays into that. It's identifying this within local areas what the network of sites are and how they can be used at different points and the expectations on each of these sites. If it is for these stopping sites that the gypsy travellers are going to be staying on them for an overnight stay, then the impact on the local community, for instance, could arguably be seen as much smaller. But what's also important then is that the follow-on services to maintain that site and to tidy that site or whatever after gypsy travellers have been resident on it is maintained, and the responsibility for that sits both with the gypsy travellers themselves and with local authorities to maintain. So it's ensuring that sites are identified for particular purposes, and there's a network of sites to meet all the needs that are identified.
Thank you for that, it's very helpful. James Dornan has a supplementary and then I'll come back to Marco Biaggi.
Good morning, Minister. In your opening comments and in response to the comments from Marco Biaggi, you accepted, as have others mentioned, that the gypsy travellers are discriminated against, probably more than any other sector in Scottish society. Would the Scottish Government, are the Scottish Government considering, or would they consider a campaign along the lines of Show Racism the Red Card to help with public awareness and education in that regard?
I think that's something that's worth looking at, absolutely, because it's clear throughout that the discrimination remains and has not been addressed as it perhaps could have been, so it's certainly something that's worth looking at, and we will look at that.
Back to the committee and
absolutely, yes, we'll get back to the committee in any of the comments that we've asked to leave. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Minister.
Just my last question, which may lead on very well into the points that other members want to raise, is you've mentioned, Mr Patterson in particular, the one-size-fits-all not being an approach to take, but there isn't any provision, a balance between the local and the national, and gypsy travellers are almost defined by being mobile as a population, and so will often encounter services delivered by local authorities and different local authorities delivering health, delivering social work, education, different health boards, different policing arrangements, and that has often come up to us as an area of confusion and difficulty for people who are simply expressing their natural lifestyle and moving around the country on a regular basis. Is there any way that can be strengthened and made more consistent so as to be easier to navigate for gypsy travellers as they move around?
That's one of the areas after your care inquiry, your inquiry in gypsy travellers and care, when we set up within the Parliament a cross-portfolio group to look at the issues raised there, and also I think the Health Board, I'm right in saying, is included in that group, and it is about looking at those issues. It's early days yet because the committee, I think I've just met twice since the last report was published, but that's the kind of area that this cross-departmental group will be looking at.
What sort of timescales would you envisage for that to start producing reports, new guidance, recommendations within government?
Well, I think we would obviously want to wait until the committee had produced its recommendations on this current inquiry, and then we'll look at them in the round. As the Minister says, the group has already looked at the recommendations made in the inquiry about gypsy travellers in care, and we provided a joint response to the committee's recommendations on that. We would also want to do so clearly on this inquiry too. And I think in terms of timescale, we would obviously want to move with some speed, because one of the very strong stories that has come out of both of your inquiries is about lack of progress and quite right, the frustration of communities in particular with that. So we would want to make speedy progress, but also we would want to do a good job and to do it thoroughly, and to enable it to take the time it needs to do so.
I now move on to John Mason, who wanted to ask about national action and single outcome agreements.
Yes, I mean, we've had quite a lot already. I mean, almost everybody who has spoken has touched on the area of national leadership as against local leadership, and I've listened to the answers, and frankly I have to say I'm disappointed. We just seem to be making no progress. I am I think the newest member, apart from Mr Donnan, who's temporary, on the committee, so I came into this part way through. I haven't been to all the visits, I've only been to one site. I understand it was better than some, but still left a lot of room for improvement. But I mean, it is very clear to me that there have been clear recommendations, I think especially Aberdeenshire, that there's a specific number of sites needed. There is absolutely no movement that I can see in the local community. And all we're hearing, I'm afraid, from the team so far are words like monitoring through dialogue. There is ongoing dialogue. We need an up-to-date needs analysis. I mean, that kind of phrase could be used every day to say, well, we've got yesterday's analysis, so we can't do anything till we get tomorrow's. I mean, there just seems to be absolutely no movement in this. And I feel frustrated. I think, to some extent, I mean, I take the point about we want to support local communities. It's up to them. We've got the Concordat. We've got the single outcome agreements. But clearly something is not happening in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire specifically. And it may be that the councillors are scared of the local community. And if the councillors are scared of the local community, surely the government has to step in.
Well, I think we've always got to be mindful. We do have a Concordat agreement with the Scottish Government and COSLA, and that agreement as is just now. And I think you would also agree that it would not be, there is no process that allows the Scottish Government to step into Aberdeenshire or Aberdeen and say, we want a site for a gypsy travelling community in that particular area. That doesn't happen anywhere. There's no process that allows that. And we very much believe, and I take what you're saying, you don't think there's been much progress made. I think there has been progress made since 2001. I agree with you, the progress has not been quick enough. What we are trying to do now is address this. We've taken on board and set up a cross-departmental group within the Scottish Parliament to look at this. We're taking it seriously. We're taking this inquiry seriously. I have committed to go back to COSLA on it and raise with the issues that have been raised here. And I think that's the way to do it. I honestly believe that the best way is to bring people on board and actually get it from the ground up using the local stakeholders and do it that way than imposing it on them. And there is no process that allows us to do that at the moment. So I think I've heard what you've said, but we are taking this seriously, and we will raise these issues with COSLA. I take them seriously as well. I've looked at the evidence. It is concerning that the condition that some of the sites are in. It's also concerning that there's still this look that an area has looked at 111 sites and none have been suitable. That's concerning, but we're still in dialogue with them. We've given money to do that, and we're working with them to try and get a solution.
I appreciate your answer. I mean, I'm completely convinced that you personally are committed to this and want to take this forward. And I completely agree with you as well that it should be ideally grassroots upwards. But what I've clearly seen, and I think the committee has seen more so, is there is a real open resistance among settled communities to really any movement on this. And I take your point that, you know, we cannot say to Aberdeenshire, you must put a site here. But I think there does come a time when, you know, we have to go beyond the Concordat and single outcome agreements. I mean, that happened with class sizes, didn't it? Because the councils wanted to have smaller class sizes, many of them. They were then challenged in court by parents, and the parents beat the councils and enforced larger classes. And at that stage, the Parliament came in and legislated, in a sense, to support the councils. And in one sense, I'm suggesting that actually Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire need support from us, because they're in quite a weak position. Their councillors are understandably swayed by local opinion, and nothing is going to happen for the next 10 years unless there's a lot stronger emphasis from the centre.
Well, I would hope something would happen within the next 10 years and would take that to them. But I think we can't legislate just for Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. Any legislation would be across Scotland, and it's over-legislating in some areas, and it's still perhaps not resolving the problem in Aberdeen. So, again, all I'm saying is that we will take this back. We know how serious the matter is. We'll talk again to Aberdeenshire. We'll talk to COSLA, and that's the first stage of it. We will look at it again if nothing works there. But I don't think legislation coming in with a heavy hand and the time to get that legislation through and the consultation that would be involved would address the matter any quicker.
Just following on from that, Minister, I wonder if there is an understanding of the frustration amongst the gypsy travelling community, because we are now looking at this issue again. There have been a number of recommendations made, and the gypsy travelling community as a whole do feel very, very let down by the government. Recommendations have not been followed up, no real progress has been made, and the gypsy travelling community have, to a certain extent, been resistant to engaging with us during this work, because in their mind we are doing another inquiry which will ultimately make no difference to their lives. And while I absolutely believe that you are committed to making a change, what I am very clear, and the rest of the committee is clear, we don't want another set of guidelines and another set of recommendations which in 5 years' time we're going to be in the position we're in now. And I just really wonder on your view on that.
Well, I don't want that either. And that's why I said we'll take this forward. We're taking it across government departments, and we're looking at this seriously. So I'm not wanting that either.
Do you see an end time for whatever recommendations or decisions that you take following this, for a conclusion of this?
I think what I can say is when we put forward our proposals, they'll be actioned and there'll be a suggestion, you know, for each proposal. Once we've had your final recommendation, we'll look at that and how we take it forward, and hopefully any action plan we will have a time scale on. But what I can't promise here is that I can say that we will legislate and that local authorities will, by a certain date, have X number of extra pitches in their local authority area. That's going to take longer than me saying, yes, I can give you a timescale for that, because I can't at this stage. What I can say is we're taking this back to COSLA. We'll come back to you when we've spoken to COSLA. We've consulted with local authorities, and we will come back to the committee and take on board what you say.
Thank you very much for that. Yes, Marco Biaggi as a supplementary.
Just a very quick supplementary. I mean, it's clear from what we've heard that there has been some improvement in areas like health and schooling, although that remains patchy. There has been a noticeable improvement in that in a way that there hasn't been in the planning process in the past decade. Why do you think there has been progress there, whereas progress in planning for sites has been a bit more disappointing?
For that one, I honestly, I'm not even going to put forward a suggestion or an answer. But what I am saying is that there's an opportunity now, as was mentioned by Gordon, about the planning framework and the planning process coming forward, to feed into that in the consultation starting very soon. And I think that's an opportunity to actually get in there and make the views known clearly. And we as a government can look at that as well and feed that through the relevant departments. But I don't have the answer for your question.
Asking purely on the basis that there may be good lessons there that could carry across, but I will pass over to the next member.
Thank you. Siobhan McMahon, who wanted to ask about tenancy agreements in Girfeck and the Count.
Okay, if I may just ask a supplementary on what's went before. I mean, I think one of the things that has already been said is the cross-departmental group, which I do welcome. However, it was mentioned that the report, our last report, we've had feedback from it, and I have to say, we haven't discussed it as a committee, but I was extremely disappointed by the government's response to our report. So I would really hope that this one's taken slightly more seriously. COSLA's been mentioned a lot, Minister. What I wanted to know is if COSLA need extra finance to do the things that we're asking them to do as a committee, the recommendations we'll do, and of course the government would want to see them do, would you provide greater finance for COSLA to do this? And on that, you mentioned that you can't set deadlines to when pitches will be made available in local authorities. However, you said yourself, you gave the example of housing and what we've done there, and we certainly gave an end date to that, to eradicating homelessness across Scotland, and that was local authorities. So I don't see the difference when it comes to Gypsy travellers and their housing needs.
Well, a couple of things there. I forgot your first point, sorry, Siobhan.
Just the report from the first one, that was just a comment.
Yeah, but I think there was only two parts of that were in my portfolio in housing. But we do take this seriously, and the last report has been looked at seriously again across government, and we'll continue to do that. And I think it maybe highlights that we have to look at this, somebody with overall responsibility for it perhaps maybe is the way forward to ensure that everything is addressed. In terms of the finance, I am not the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, but certainly if identified there was a need there, it would be certainly fed back to the Finance Department, but I can't commit finances at this stage.
And what about then the commitment to the pitches and the Homelessness Act? What's the difference?
I think we need to look at that. I think it's more difficult when you've got a travelling community. I really do think it is quite different. In the Homelessness Act, it's what we've said is people will get settled accommodation, and I accept the fact that for Gypsy travellers, settled accommodation would be within their lifestyle. But what we haven't done is, and it was never a commitment to eradicate homelessness, and that's something that we have never said that we can eradicate homelessness, and as we know, there will always be homeless people. So I don't think the correlation is just quite the same. What we're saying is that we've looked at in areas where that there's a shortfall in pitches, and that's something that we can look at, but it wouldn't say there will always be a pitch for everybody that requires it. It's no different from the homeless legislations we have just now.
We certainly had an end date to the homeless legislation that we had now, and that was the point I was making. You said no end date could be passed on Gypsy travellers, and I think by saying that we're causing the inequality. We are showing that there's an inequality between Gypsy travellers and settled communities if we can't get round a policy that has an end date, and we certainly did have that.
But I think we have to look at the policy that had an end date was that people would be provided settled accommodation. They're not by December 2012. It didn't say that everybody will get that settled accommodation in December 2012. As you know, the housing list, you're well aware of that, and it was people who were non-intentionally homeless. So I think I don't see it as being the same, but it's something, I mean, I'll certainly take back to the team and look at, is there an end date we can put on? We will increase the number of pitches, or we'd expect to see the number of pitches increased by a specific date, and that might be the way forward, as opposed to saying we can end this.
Very helpful, Minister. On the numbers then, that's come up quite a lot. We know that Gypsy travellers do not self-identify as such due to discrimination. In the most part, we've heard in evidence that that's probably one of the main reasons. And what the Scottish Government doing to look at that, to make sure we get accurate numbers for Gypsy travellers, because we understand the official number and the unofficial number is a huge difference, and sometimes 10 times a difference. So what are the Scottish Government doing to address that?
Yes, obviously the committee is aware that the government used to run a twice annual count where the number of households and individuals in those households on sites, both local authority sites, privately owned sites and indeed unauthorised sites, were tallied up twice a year. There were some views that wasn't a particularly helpful exercise, and indeed there were some quite strong views from members of the Gypsy Traveller community themselves that they didn't like that, and they didn't like the fact that their community was being accounted in a way that other communities weren't. And I think that was a perfectly reasonable point to make. So we have been considering, our analytical colleagues have been considering if there are better ways that we can get information about numbers of Gypsy travellers in Scotland. We did add a tick box under the ethnicity classification for the census in 2011. And that is used for other statistical classifications as well. And that's the first time that had been done. We'll get the analysis from that later this year. But I think you make a good point that this is a group that experiences a lot of discrimination and may therefore be reluctant to tick that box. So we need to look at other ways that we can get information from survey data and so on that we already have. We also consulted with with people who use the data from the count to ask what their view was about continuing that or finding other methods. And the results of that consultation were quite mixed. Some people said that they found it useful, others said that they didn't really find it useful. So we are looking across the whole range of our statistical collections at the moment, and Gypsy Traveller headcount is part of that consideration, and colleagues in analytical services will be making recommendations to ministers quite shortly about the way forward. So once that process has come to its conclusion, we'll be able to inform the committee of the results of that. Chairman, if it was possible just to add something to a point that Ms McMahon made. I'm sorry that you found our report to the care inquiry disappointing, but I just would like to make clear that there has actually been progress made since that report was drafted and sent to the committee, and we will be able to provide that in writing to the committee. Obviously there were a lot of recommendations. It would take up far too much time this morning to go through all of those and to report on the progress that's been made, but there has been some progress made across the recommendations, so I will be able to provide the committee with that.
I'm pleased to hear that, and thank you for the first response as well. I think it was very helpful and a lot of information contained in that. So I do hope that when the analytical services look at it, we do get better. But of course, there is a challenge of the discrimination factor if you self-identify, and I suppose that comes back to the point that James Dornan had made in possibly having a campaign to show others the community that you don't have to obviously discriminate against this particular ethnic group. The other point I wish to make was on tenancy agreements, and you'll know from the 2001 report there was a recommendation to have a standard tenancy agreement across Scotland. We've heard in evidence that that would be welcomed not only by local authorities but by community councils, by the Gypsy travellers themselves. So I'm just wondering what progress has been made on that, given that Amnesty have done their own tenancy agreement and they found that only 3 sites had been using the standard recommendations. And following on from that, the Gypsy travellers themselves see it as a list of what not to do rather than an agreement when they're signing that form. So what progress has been made on that, and will it be something you look at to make a standard tenancy agreement?
I think that it's something we have to look at. I know I've talked a lot about the autonomy of local authorities, but I do think that there was no consensus reached on a tenancy agreement before. There was a lot of consultation and discussion, but I do think it is something that we have to look at. And I did note the evidence from the Gypsy travellers saying that it was very much about what they couldn't do. And I think any agreement should be about the rights and responsibilities of both parties. It should be very clear to Gypsy travellers when they're in a site what services they should expect from the landlord of that site. And I would hope that any tenancy agreement will include that very clearly. That point was noted by myself.
I'm very pleased to hear that obviously that is a two-way one, because that was one of the main concerns that we heard. So again, I look forward to the progress that can be made there. Okay, I thought I had a final, but this is my final one. I'm just taking over, committing now. We've heard in evidence again from the Gypsy traveller community about how their children in schools, again, this discrimination factor comes up, and the lack of knowledge amongst the teaching profession of how to teach children, give the right materials to the children because they are travelling. How does the strategy of the government getting it right for every child, how can that be developed to help, and specifically, the Gypsy traveller community?
That's certainly something the cross-department group are looking at, and we'll certainly go back to the education side as well. It is concerning to everyone that the Gypsy traveller children, particularly in secondary school, I did read that in the secondary school, that they're being discriminated against and bullied and frightened to go to school. And I think that has been fed back, and that will be reported back to you, how the education, that is not in my portfolio, but certainly it's something that will be fed back and you'll get a response on.
Okay, because as we know, getting it right for every child is across portfolios as well, not solely education.
I think that is something that certainly is a concern for all of us, and that has to be looked at. There's no question of that.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just briefly ask you, Minister, in relation to the equality duties framework, do you see the local authorities as having a need to engage with the Gypsy travellers under that framework? I accept that you can give local authorities guidance in involving Gypsy travellers in planning decisions and discussions around where sites could, should be and possibly may be. But do you see another avenue to encourage, shall we say, local authorities to engage through the equality duties framework?
I think any avenue to encourage local authorities should be promoted and used, and I don't know if you want to add a bit to that, Leslie.
Thank you, Minister. Absolutely. Obviously, there is the public sector equality duty, which binds the Scottish Government and all other public bodies, including local authorities, which requires them to eliminate discrimination, promote good relations and promote equality of opportunity between people of different groups. All public bodies are in the process now of producing their equality outcomes, which Scottish ministers have the power to impose specific duties under the terms of the Equality Act, although obviously that's reserved legislation. And so the Scottish Government as all other public bodies, is just now undergoing an exercise of developing equality outcomes. Now, these outcomes provide an opportunity to really drive forward equality for disadvantaged groups, including gypsy travellers. So this is a good moment in time to, I suppose, take the temperature of public bodies across Scotland and their commitment to doing so. So those equality outcomes will be published by the end of April. So the committee will be able to see fairly soon, right across all the public bodies in Scotland, including the government, where they have identified and prioritised the areas that they want to deliver. The equality outcomes have to be reported on, and a new set of outcomes have to be developed by 2017. So this will be a rolling programme whereby the public sector across Scotland will be developing and reporting on equality outcomes. So we will be able through that process to get a better sense of where work is being driven forward and where it's not, and as the Minister suggests, it gives opportunities to advise where we think things are not going well. It's obviously the Equality and Human Rights Commission is the monitoring body for the Equality Act, and as the committee knows, they take a keen interest in gypsy traveller issues and have done for many years. So I'm quite confident that this is something that they will be looking for in the equality outcomes.
Thank you very much for that. Do committee members have any further questions for our witnesses this morning? Is there? All right, sorry, I've just got one final question I wanted to ask Ms Irving. The most recent race equality statement covered 2008 to 2011. When will this be updated, and will it comment on the progress of the previous strategy?
It will be updated. Certainly, it will be updated. We'll be providing a short statement about race equality and other aspects of equality across protected characteristics in April in order to support the publication of the government's own equality outcome material. But then later this year, we plan to produce a number of documents, including one as a refreshed and updated race equality statement. So that will reflect back on the previous one, and also take it forward into new areas, because race equality, as other equality areas, it's a dynamic and evolving area, and we want to refocus on new priorities around tackling hate crime, dealing with employability, given the economic situation, and bringing it up to date. So there will be a report on where we've come from, and also set out a way forward. We'll be going into consultation on that over the summer.
Thank you very much for that. As there are no further questions from committee members this morning, can I thank our witnesses for coming along? Your evidence has certainly been very useful to us, and I think we've all got a lot out of this morning's evidence session. So can I thank the Minister particularly for coming along this morning. And that concludes our final evidence session on Where Gypsy Travellers Live. We expect to consider evidence over the next coming weeks and publish our report later in the spring. And the meeting will now move into private session. Our next meeting will take place on Thursday the 28th of February and will include oral evidence from the European Commission on Human Rights. And I'm now going to suspend the meeting to allow the room to clear and move into private session. Thank you.